Alex couldn't remember the last time he'd felt this happy about getting off work early. He'd been sure he'd be pulling an all-nighter, but a last-minute schedule change meant he could clock out by 11 p.m. With a grin plastered on his face and a bit of a bounce in his step, he headed for home, eager to surprise his wife, Claire. He imagined the look on her face when he showed up, knowing she'd expected him back in the morning. The thought made him drive a little faster, his mind buzzing with plans for a relaxing evening together. On the way, he stopped to pick up a bottle of wine and a bouquet of flowers, just a little something extra to make the night special. But as he pulled into the driveway, an unsettling feeling crept over him. Claire's car wasn't there, the house looked dark, and something felt off. He tried to shake it off, thinking maybe she'd just run out for something quick. But when he stepped inside, the eerie silence hit him. No lights, no sign of Claire. The whole house felt empty in a way that put him on edge. Where could she be? He muttered, pulling out his phone. He dialed Claire's number, tapping his fingers nervously on the counter as he waited for her to pick up. Finally, she answered, but her voice was flat, almost annoyed. "Alex?" "Hey, Claire. Where are you?" "I got off work early," he replied, his voice still filled with excitement. There was a long pause before she spoke again, her tone cold and dismissive. "I'm not coming home tonight." Alex froze, blinking in confusion. "What? What do you mean you're not coming home?" She sighed, irritation dripping from her words. "Didn't you understand the first time?" His heart started to pound, a cold unease settling over him. "Claire, what's going on? Why aren't you coming home?" "I have some urgent work to handle," she replied coolly. "Just don't bother me, okay? I'll be back tomorrow." The line went dead, leaving Alex standing there in the quiet of the empty house, his stomach twisting with a sickening sense of dread. Claire had never spoken to him like that before, so cold, so distant. What had started as confusion was quickly morphing into anger. Tightening his grip on the phone, he could feel the frustration rising in his chest. "Claire, this is ridiculous. Why are you treating me like this?" he said out loud to himself, the silence pressing in around him. She hadn't even given him the courtesy of a proper explanation. He stood there in the empty room, staring at the driveway outside, and promised himself he'd get to the bottom of it. Whatever was going on, he wasn't letting it slide. The next morning, Alex sat at the kitchen table, jaw clenched, waiting. When he heard her car pulling into the driveway, his pulse quickened. She strolled in like nothing unusual had happened, giving him a brief glance before heading straight for the stairs. "Morning," she said coolly, her voice casual as if the previous night had never happened. She brushed right past him. "I'm going to take a shower." Alex's frustration built as he watched her head upstairs without so much as a word of explanation. The silence between them hung heavy, and while every part of him wanted to confront her right there, he decided to wait. Let her believe everything was fine for now. He sat in the silence until he heard the sound of water running. Something in his gut urged him to act, so he went outside and opened her car. The warmth still radiated from the drive, and he slid into the seat. His gaze landed on her tablet, the one she used for navigation. With hands trembling just slightly, he started scrolling through her recent destinations, determined to get answers. One address leapt out at him. She'd spent the night parked in a quiet neighborhood across the city, right outside a house at 251 Oakwood Drive. Alex stared at the screen, his heart pounding harder with each second. What could have kept her there all night? Shaking his head, he opened the glove compartment, not exactly sure what he was hoping to find, but what he did find left him frozen. There was an open box of condoms, with one missing. They hadn't used condoms in years, there was no reason for that box to be in her car. His hands felt numb as he closed the compartment, his stomach twisting with a mix of shock and betrayal. The picture was coming together in the worst possible way, each piece falling into place painfully clear. Back in the house, he could still hear the water running upstairs. He sat at the kitchen table, staring at the floor as he waited for her to come down. Minutes ticked by slowly, but he held himself steady. As soon as he heard her steps, he looked up, ready. Claire came down, her wet hair wrapped in a towel, looking relaxed and unconcerned. She barely glanced his way until she caught sight of his hard, unwavering stare. She stopped mid-step, her expression shifting to something guarded. "What?" she asked, her tone already defensive. "We need to talk," Alex replied, his voice steady but cold. She rolled her eyes, exasperated. "About what now?" "About where you were last night," he said, his gaze fixed firmly on her, refusing to let up. He held her car keys in his hand, almost daring her to lie. Claire's face darkened, her mouth twisting in annoyance. "What the hell, Alex? Were you digging through my car? Going through my stuff? Just answer the question," he shot back, his frustration beginning to show. "Who lives at 251, Oakwood Drive? Why were you there all night?" For a brief moment, her eyes flickered with something, guilt? Defiance? He couldn't quite tell. But she straightened up, crossing her arms, her expression unreadable. "It's Dave's house," she answered flatly. Alex felt his stomach drop. "Dave? The guy from your office?" "Yeah," she replied without a hint of emotion. "I stayed the night there." Alex's fists clenched as he fought to keep his anger in check. "You think I'm a fool, Claire? You spend the night at another man's house, and then I find condoms in your car. And you expect me to believe nothing happened?" Her eyes narrowed, face unyielding. "So what if I stayed there?" "It's not what you think." "Then what is it, Claire?" His voice grew louder, his patience running thin. "Is he your lover?" Claire took a deep breath, her tone softening ever so slightly. "No, Alex. Dave isn't my lover." He glared at her, almost daring her to say more. "Then why were you there? And don't insult me with some nonsense excuse. I deserve the truth." Her posture shifted, and her arms dropped to her sides as the irritation faded from her face, replaced by a chilling calm. "Look, I had problems at work," she finally said. "Dave helped cover for me with our bosses. If he hadn't, I could have lost my job. I went over there to thank him." "To thank him?" Alex's voice dripped with disbelief. "So what, sleeping with him was your way of saying, thank you?" Claire's expression didn't change. "It was my decision, Alex. Dave didn't ask for anything. I knew he was attracted to me, and I wanted to show him my appreciation." Alex's blood ran cold. "You mean, you slept with him as some kind of reward?" Her calm demeanor was maddening. "Yes," she said simply. "It wasn't cheating, Alex. It was a straightforward exchange. No emotions. Just honesty." Alex stared at her, feeling the weight of her words like a punch to the gut. He couldn't fathom how cold, how absurd it sounded. "You're telling me you sold yourself for your career?" She looked him in the eye without a trace of guilt. "I offered him a little happiness in exchange for his help. That's all," she finished, and the weight of her words crashed over Alex, heavy and unforgiving. His chest tightened painfully as he struggled to absorb the reality of what she was saying. "Claire, how could you possibly think that was okay?" he managed, his voice barely above a whisper. She shrugged with a dismissive smile. "It was just a professional courtesy. He did something for me, so I did something for him. End of story." Alex felt his world shatter in that moment. He could hardly believe what he was hearing. Claire, standing there without the slightest hint of guilt or shame, watching him with an eerie calm that twisted the knife even further. "Alex," she continued, her voice disturbingly even, "I don't see any reason to dwell on this. Sure, it may upset you now, but you're my husband, and you know I love you. One night, one tiny mistake shouldn't be enough to end our marriage. She said it like she was smoothing over a minor mishap, as though she'd accidentally scuffed his shoes, not ripped apart their marriage vows. Alex's mind whirled, heart pounding with a mix of disbelief and anger. It was as if she expected him to sweep this under the rug, pretend it was insignificant. "Let's just forget about it," Claire added breezily, like she was suggesting they ignore a misplaced bill. Alex found himself unable to respond. His mouth was dry, his throat constricted under the weight of her betrayal. In the suffocating silence, her gaze drifted to the bouquet of flowers he'd brought home the night before, the ones he'd picked out to surprise her after his unexpected early shift. A smile spread across her face, bright and carefree. "Oh, honey, are these for me?" She walked over and admired the blooms with a look of pure delight. "You're always so thoughtful." She didn't even wait for his response. Instead, she turned to the bottle of wine he'd bought, popping it open with an easy smile. She grabbed 2 glasses, poured them each a drink, acting like everything was perfectly fine, as if she hadn't just confessed to cheating on him for her career. She handed him a glass, lifting her own in a casual toast. "Alex, I'm sorry. Maybe I acted impulsively, but let's just move past this, all right?" Her tone was almost playful, as she took a sip of wine, watching him over the rim of her glass. Alex sat there frozen, his mind spinning as he stared at her, unable to reconcile how she could dismiss everything so casually. She seemed to believe her sweet words and charming smile could erase the betrayal, smooth over the cracks in his heart. Her calm manipulation made his blood boil. She wasn't sorry. She wasn't even pretending to be. To her, this wasn't a mistake, it was a calculated move, a choice she'd made without a second thought. Without a word, Alex drained his wine and stood up. Claire gave him a curious glance, but he couldn't stay in the room a moment longer. The air felt thick with her lies, suffocating him. He needed to clear his head. Stepping outside, he took in a sharp breath of cool morning air, the chill biting at his skin as he paced the porch, running a hand through his hair in frustration. Claire's betrayal had cut deep, but the way she brushed it off, expecting him to just go along with it, stung even more. She thought he'd keep playing the role of the loyal husband, as if her actions held no weight, as if he was supposed to accept her cold calculation without question. But Alex understood now. This wasn't a one-time lapse in judgment. Her calm, controlled attitude made it clear that what she'd done was no accident. It was a choice, a deliberate, selfish decision. If she thought she could treat him like a fool, she was sorely mistaken. If she wanted to play games, he'd play along. For now. But this game would be played on his terms. If she wanted to pull the strings, then he'd let her think she was in control. The longer he mulled it over, the more his plan took shape. If Claire wanted to make him feel like a fool, he'd let her believe she'd succeeded. But before he handed over those divorce papers, before she thought she'd slip away without consequence, he would leave her with something unforgettable, a small, elegant act of revenge she'd never see coming. Standing on the porch, watching the first light break over the horizon, Alex felt the first genuine smile he'd managed in hours. Claire thought she was holding the cards, that she was pulling the strings. But she was about to learn what it was like to be on the other side, to be played. First, he needed to see a lawyer. But before that, he had a little surprise to plan. As he stood there, his mind was already working out the details. Claire thought she'd outsmarted him, but she had shown her true vulnerability, her career. If her job meant enough to betray her marriage, then that was the perfect place to strike. But before anything could be set in motion, he'd need an airtight alibi to keep him far from suspicion. He took a deep breath, steeling himself, and walked back inside, shifting into the role of the forgiving husband for just a bit longer. "Claire," he called as he entered the kitchen, where she was sipping her wine with casual ease. She looked up, her face softening when she saw the change in his demeanor. He forced a small, hesitant smile. "I've been thinking," Alex started, sitting down across from her. "Maybe you're right. We've been through a lot, and one mistake shouldn't tear us apart." She brightened a bit, relief clear in her expression. "I knew you'd see it that way, Alex. We're stronger than this." He nodded, suppressing the bitterness rising inside him. "Let's put this behind us. I don't want to lose what we've built." Claire reached across the table, clasping his hand with a warm smile as if everything had settled back into place. But Alex's mind was already racing ahead. She was falling right into his plan. The next morning, Alex went to work with a clear objective in mind. He went straight to his boss's office, knocking on the door and stepping inside when Bob, his manager, motioned him in. "Alex, what's up?" Bob asked, leaning back in his chair, clearly expecting just another workday discussion. "Bob, I could use a favor," Alex said, doing his best to sound relaxed. "I'd like to request a business trip to our production site in the next city. I think it's due for an inspection, and it'd be good for me to get away for a bit." Bob raised an eyebrow. "A business trip? Now? You don't usually ask for that." Alex shrugged, keeping his tone casual. "Yeah, it's been a stressful few weeks, and I think it'd be a good change of pace. Plus, it's been a while since anyone's checked up on the production site." Bob leaned forward, considering. "You know, I've been meaning to send someone out for an inspection. Might be a good opportunity for you. How much time do you need?" "A week should do it," Alex replied, already envisioning how his plan would unfold. Bob nodded. "All right, I'll get the paperwork sorted today. Everything you need should be ready by the end of the week." "Thanks, Bob. I really appreciate it." By that afternoon, Alex had the complete set of official documents for his trip, signed papers, company authorizations, everything needed to make his absence perfectly legitimate. It was the alibi he'd been looking for. That evening, he showed Claire the paperwork, casually handing it to her over dinner. "Looks like I've got a business trip lined up," he said. "I'll be out for a week, starting Monday." Claire glanced at the papers, quickly scanning them before handing them back. "A whole week, huh? Well, I'll miss you, but work is work, right?" "Exactly," Alex replied, keeping his tone neutral. "Just another part of the job." Claire smiled, showing no hint of doubt or suspicion, just as Alex had hoped. She was completely convinced, which suited him perfectly. Over the following days, Alex began setting his plan in motion. With his alibi secured, he shifted his focus to finding the right people to help execute his plan. After a bit of research, he came across a group of young event planners who specialized in flash mobs and elaborate pranks. They'd orchestrated all kinds of public stunts, and Alex's unique request piqued their interest. He met the team at a small cafe a few miles from home, laying out his vision in detail, a meticulously planned scene that would leave Claire feeling shaken, humiliated, and confused, but nothing that would go too far. He wanted it classy, subtle, but absolutely unforgettable. "So, you're asking us to stage a show?" one of the organizers asked, intrigued yet curious. Alex nodded seriously. "Exactly. I need something that'll make her feel like she's losing her grip. It should be personal, as if her own secrets are being laid bare, but in a way that makes her question everything around her." The team exchanged glances, already brainstorming ideas. "We can do that," one of them assured him with a grin. "We've pulled off plenty of stunts like this, and trust me, if you want her to feel the heat, we'll make it happen." Monday morning arrived, and Alex set off for his business trip, every official paper in order. Claire saw him off without a second thought, assuming everything between them had returned to normal. She had no idea what lay ahead. Like any other day, Claire began her morning routine with a stop at the cafe near her office for her usual coffee and croissant. The comforting scent of fresh pastries filled the air as she entered. She placed her order and waited at the counter, savoring the familiar routine. Just as she reached for her cup, a man in a sharp suit stepped up beside her. He glanced her way, his eyes lighting up with apparent recognition, then gave her a smug, knowing smile. "Oh, it's you, he said, his tone dripping with an insincere friendliness. I recognized you. You're the one who, thanks her colleagues at work, in bed. So considerate of you. Claire froze, the words hitting her like a slap. Her heart raced as she stared at him, utterly bewildered. Excuse me, she stammered, her voice unsteady. The man chuckled, his face serious but with a faint smirk that made her skin crawl. I mean, it's generous of you. Not everyone's that, giving with their coworkers. With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Claire standing there in stunned silence. She stayed rooted to the spot, trying to process what had just happened, her mind swirling with shock and confusion. Surely, this had to be some mistake. Maybe the man had confused her with someone else. She shook off the unease, grabbed her coffee and croissant, and left the cafe, trying to ignore the strange interaction, though her mind was still spinning. The next morning, she returned to the cafe, though yesterday's odd encounter nagged at the back of her mind. She tried to brush it off. People said strange things all the time. It didn't have to mean anything. As she stepped up to place her order, an older gentleman in an immaculate suit shuffled up beside her. His eyes widened in recognition, and he turned to her with a warm, approving smile. "Oh, madam," he exclaimed, admiration in his voice. "I've heard of your generosity. It's truly inspiring. Sharing yourself for the sake of career success. Such a noble sacrifice." Claire's face went pale, her mind reeling. She blinked at him, struggling to find words as a heavy pit formed in her stomach. "What? What are you talking about?" she managed, her voice barely a whisper. The elderly man waved her concern away with a dismissive hand. "Oh, don't be modest. Word gets around about people like you. So selfless, so willing to accommodate for the sake of others. Quite the story." He offered a final nod and walked off, leaving Claire standing there, shaken. Her hands trembled as she picked up her coffee, her mind racing. This couldn't be a coincidence. Twice now, strangers had made these horrible, insinuating comments. But how? How did they know? She left the cafe in a daze, her heart pounding as paranoia began to wrap around her like a vice. As she walked to her office, her mind kept circling back to that night with Dave. No one knew about it. No one except him. By midweek, Claire was on edge, nerves frayed as she convinced herself that the past encounters might have been random, meaningless. But as she stepped into the cafe that morning, dread washed over her. She placed her order and waited, glancing around, her anxiety mounting. Just as the barista called her name, a young woman carrying a tray of drinks stepped up beside her, smiling brightly as though she recognized her. "Oh, you're that Claire, right?" the girl said with a cheerful tone. "My friend works with you and told me about how caring you are. Especially to the guys at the office." She winked playfully. "Thanks for being so considerate." Claire's breath caught in her throat. She grabbed her coffee and hurried out of the cafe, her mind now spiraling into a full-blown panic. This wasn't random anymore. Someone knew, and it was spreading. By the time she reached her office, she could barely focus. Her phone felt heavy in her hand as she dialed Alex's number, desperate for some reassurance, some kind of explanation. "Alex, something weird is happening," she blurted out the moment he answered. "Strangers, they're saying things about me, things about that night. It's like they know, Alex. They know." A pause lingered on the other end before Alex spoke, his voice sharp and annoyed. "Claire, why are you bringing this up again? I thought we agreed to move on." I know, but this feels different," she stammered. "It's like someone spreading rumors, or... Alex, are you involved in this?" Her voice cracked, desperate for answers. Alex sighed, exasperated. "Claire, really? You think I'm behind this? I told you, I've let it go. Why can't you?" "Alex, please, I just... Listen, he cut her off, his tone firm. I'm busy. I don't have time for this nonsense. A moment later, he connected a video call, showing her he was walking through the production floor, wearing a hard hat and a safety vest. See? I'm here, doing actual work. I don't care about the past, Claire. Stop bothering me with this. Claire's heart sank as she watched Alex move through the factory floor, his face detached, focused entirely on his work. I'm sorry, she whispered, feeling embarrassed for bringing it up. It's strange. I've got to go, Alex replied briskly. Don't call me unless it's important. And with that, he ended the call. Claire leaned back in her chair, her mind a mess of confusion and fear. She couldn't shake the dreadful feeling that somehow, everyone knew, that her secret wasn't a secret anymore. Then, a chilling realization struck her, Dave. He was the only other person who knew. Could he have let something slip, or worse, intentionally betrayed her? As the pieces started to fall into place, Claire's panic intensified. She had to confront Dave, to find out if he'd been the one to expose her. But for now, she was trapped, overwhelmed with fear, unsure who to trust, and desperately clinging to her crumbling facade. She needed answers, and she needed them immediately. Her mind raced as she walked down the hall and found Dave in his office, seated at his desk, unaware of the storm heading his way. She stepped in, quietly closing the door behind her, taking a steadying breath before speaking. Her voice was low, barely above a whisper, but charged with frustration and fear. Dave, she hissed, leaning in close. Did you tell anyone about our meeting? Dave looked up, his expression baffled. What? Claire, what are you talking about? She narrowed her eyes, her voice trembling with anger. You know exactly what I mean. That night. Did you tell anyone? Dave's face turned pale as he realized what she was accusing him of. No, of course not. I would never. Don't lie to me, she snapped, still whispering but with a hard edge. If management finds out, we're both finished. You know the company's rules about relationships between employees. She stepped closer, her frustration boiling over. Are you insane? Do you realize what this could cost us? Dave, visibly shaken, held his hands up defensively. Claire, I swear, I haven't told anyone. I wouldn't jeopardize my career like that. You know me better. Claire studied his face, searching for any sign of dishonesty, but all she saw was his genuine confusion and fear. Her anger simmered as she stepped back, her pulse pounding even faster. If Dave wasn't responsible, then who could be spreading these rumors? She left his office, her thoughts spiraling into a chaotic whirlwind. The strange encounters, the unsettling comments from strangers, it didn't add up. A chill ran down her spine. Was she losing her mind? Or was someone toying with her in some twisted way? The rest of the day dragged by, each minute weighed down by her growing paranoia. By the time she was ready to leave the office, her nerves were frayed to the breaking point. She clutched a folder of documents tightly to her chest as she exited the building, lost in her troubled thoughts. Just then, a young man bumped into her, hard enough to knock the folder from her hands. Papers scattered across the pavement, fluttering in the light breeze. Oh, I'm so sorry, he said quickly, bending down to help her gather the scattered documents. Claire knelt down beside him, struggling to keep her frustration in check. It's okay, it's my fault. I wasn't paying attention, she muttered, her voice strained as she grabbed the last of the papers. Thanks for helping. The young man flashed a smile, a strange glint in his eyes. No need for verbal thanks, he said smoothly, standing up and brushing himself off. You can thank me by giving me a night with you, for saving your papers. Claire's heart skipped a beat, her gaze snapping to his, filled with disbelief. What did you just say? She managed, her voice shaky. The guy's grin widened. I can see it in your eyes. You like showing your appreciation to men, especially when it's career-related, right? Claire's temper flared, and before she could stop herself, she hurled the folder at him. "You sick creep," she yelled, her voice trembling with anger. "Get lost." The man just laughed, a dark, twisted chuckle that sent a chill down her spine. Then, without another word, he turned and sprinted down the street, disappearing around the corner before she could even think to chase him. Breathing heavily, Claire stood frozen, her whole body shaking with a mix of fury and fear. It felt like the world was spinning out of her control. Everywhere she went, people were whispering about that night, taunting her as if her secret was common knowledge. That evening, Claire sat alone in her dim living room, gripping a glass of wine with shaky hands. She'd barely touched her dinner, her stomach knotted, her mind spinning with the strange events of the last few days. Her heart raced, and no amount of wine seemed to settle her nerves. She felt as if she was unraveling at the seams. None of it made sense. Who were these people, and how did they know? Or worse, was she losing her mind? The more she thought about it, the more she wondered if guilt over what she'd done with Dave was driving her to paranoia. Her hands shaking, she picked up her phone, opened her browser, and hesitated for a moment before typing in a search, "psychotherapist near me." A list of names filled the screen, and she stared at it blankly, feeling the reality sink in. She needed help. Either someone was playing an elaborate, vicious game, or her mind was betraying her. Either way, she knew one thing for certain: she was teetering on the edge of something beyond her control. By Friday morning, Claire was exhausted, her nerves shredded from the strange encounters that had haunted her all week. Determined to avoid any more humiliating situations, she decided, no coffee stop, no lingering outside. She headed straight to the office, hoping that burying herself in work might bring some relief, might help her forget. Maybe, just maybe, she could get through the day without incident. By the time her coworkers started trickling in, Claire was already at her desk, typing away with a frenzied focus. As the hours passed, a rare calm settled over her. For the first time in days, she felt like she was finally regaining control. The usual morning chatter filled the office, and Claire let out a small sigh of relief. Finally, she thought. Some peace. But the peace didn't last. About an hour later, just as she began to feel normal again, the office door swung open, and a courier walked in, holding a massive bouquet of red roses. His presence immediately drew attention, heads turning from every corner of the office. Oblivious to the growing tension, the courier made his way to the center of the room and, in a loud voice, announced, "Delivery for Claire." The words hit her like a shockwave. Claire's stomach twisted as she stood up, already feeling the weight of everyone's gaze on her. Curious and amused, several colleagues gathered around to watch the scene unfold. She approached the courier, her heart racing. "I didn't order anything," she said sharply, trying to keep her voice steady. "Why do you think these flowers are for me?" Claire demanded, her voice laced with suspicion. The courier shrugged innocently, then reached for a small card tucked between the roses. Clearing his throat, he read aloud for all in the office to hear, "For the sexiest and most divine Claire, who made me happy that magical night. Signed, Dave." A stunned silence filled the room, lasting only a split second before laughter and whispers erupted around her. Claire felt the color drain from her face as she stood frozen, horror gripping her. She could hear the muffled giggles of her coworkers, the low murmurs, and the judgmental glances sizing her up from head to toe. It was like her worst nightmare coming to life. Without thinking, Claire lunged forward and knocked the bouquet from the courier's hands, sending roses scattering across the floor. "What the hell is this?" she screamed, her voice thick with fury and humiliation. "What kind of sick joke are you playing?" Her colleagues looked on, some still snickering, others wide-eyed as her outburst continued. She couldn't hold back, her nerves had finally snapped. People whispered, exchanged knowing glances, and a few even attempted to calm her, but she was past the point of reason. "Claire, relax," one coworker murmured, though the smirk on her face made it clear she found the whole scene amusing. But for Claire, this was a nightmare, made all the worse by the absence of Dave, who was off at another office for the day on the boss's orders. As Claire struggled to catch her breath, her voice rising in frustrated obscenities at the bewildered courier backing away, the door to the boss's office suddenly swung open. Mr. White, her boss, strode out, his face a mix of confusion and concern. He looked around, taking in the scene, the scattered flowers, the courier edging toward the exit, and Claire's frenzied state, and quickly stepped into the middle of the chaos. "What on earth is going on here?" Mr. White demanded, his gaze darting between Claire, the roses, and the card. He bent down to pick up the note, quickly scanning its contents. With each word, his expression grew more serious. "Claire," he said, his tone hard, holding up the card. "What is this? Can you explain what's happening here?" Still shaking with anger, Claire struggled to form a response, her mind clouded by rage, shame, and a creeping panic. All around her, co-workers continued to watch, their whispers growing louder. "Claire," Mr. White pressed, his voice sharpening. "Did Dave actually send you these flowers? Are you two involved?" He paused, his voice growing stern. "You're married, and you know our company policy, no workplace relationships." "No. No." Claire screamed, her voice breaking. "This is some kind of setup, a cruel joke. I would never," but the words faltered, catching in her throat as her hands began to tremble uncontrollably. Mr. White studied her, his expression shifting from concern to suspicion. "Claire," he said slowly, his voice firm, "you're not making any sense. This behavior isn't rational. If Dave is involved, I need to know immediately. Otherwise, you're putting your entire career at risk." Claire's heart pounded as she looked around the room, feeling the weight of judgment, laughter, and suspicion close in on her, tightening like walls around her. "It's not true," she cried again, her voice weaker, barely convincing even to herself. I don't know what's happening. Someone's trying to ruin me." Mr. White took a deep breath, visibly attempting to keep his composure. "Claire, you need to calm down," Mr. White said, his voice measured but firm. Claire's eyes darted around the room, taking in the faces of her colleagues. Some were barely containing their laughter, others looked on with a mix of pity and amusement, exchanging those knowing glances that were driving her to the edge. It was all too much, she couldn't take it anymore. Mr. White, standing in the center of the growing chaos, saw how close Claire was to a complete breakdown. She was pale, her hands visibly trembling with rage and frustration. He knew he had to defuse the situation, not only for her sake but for the entire office, now buzzing with whispers and sidelong looks. With a forced, overly cheerful smile, he raised his voice in an attempt to lighten the mood. "All right, everyone, enough gawking. Let's get back to work. What kind of prank is this, anyway?" he chuckled, hoping a light-hearted approach would settle things. His deep, playful tone seemed to soften the atmosphere slightly. Turning to Claire, he added, "Why don't you take a couple of days off? We'll figure this out. Maybe you and Dave could even take a lie detector test if that'll clear the air. Just to keep things transparent, right?" He laughed softly, clearly not serious, trying to dismiss the incident as a misunderstanding. But he didn't realize that Claire had already crossed a line of reason. At his words, something inside her snapped. "Yes, I slept with Dave," she screamed, her voice raw with fury and humiliation. The entire office fell into stunned silence. "I rode him like a young stallion, and I enjoyed every second of it. And all of you," she spat, her gaze sweeping over the room, "you're just miserable, nosy vultures, desperate to stick your noses where they don't belong." Gasps echoed through the room as her colleagues exchanged wide-eyed looks. Claire's face turned crimson as the weight of her outburst settled in, but it was too late. The dam had burst. Tears welled up as she grabbed her purse, her hands shaking, and stormed toward the door, her sobs filling the now silent office. Just as she reached the exit, she nearly collided with Dave, who had just returned from his assignment, completely unaware of the chaos that had unfolded in his absence. His confident demeanor faltered as he took in the state she was in. "Tell them, Dave," she shouted, her voice thick with emotion. "Tell them about us rolling around at your place. They're all desperate to know because their lives are so gray and boring, stuck in this office." Dave's face drained of color, his legs nearly buckling as he struggled to process what was happening. His wide eyes darted around, landing on the shocked expressions of their coworkers. Claire's words hung in the air like a heavy, suffocating cloud. "Claire, why did you tell everyone?" he asked weakly, his voice barely audible. "That was supposed to be our secret." He looked completely lost, as if the ground had just disappeared beneath him. "So, it's true," Mr. White said, his voice now cold and humorless. His gaze fixed on Dave, his expression a mix of disappointment and frustration. "There was something going on between you two?" Dave's eyes dropped to the floor, his face pale as he mumbled, "I didn't tell anyone. I swear I didn't." Mr. White exhaled heavily, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Well, that's that, then," he muttered under his breath, loud enough for those closest to hear. Looking back at Dave with resignation, he said, "Dave, we need to have a talk. Now." As Dave followed Mr. White into his office, the rest of the staff erupted into murmurs, exchanging glances and hushed comments. Claire's breakdown, her shocking confession, and Dave's stunned reaction had thrown the office into complete turmoil. Alex returned home on Saturday, feeling a blend of satisfaction and curiosity. He'd set the wheels of Claire's downfall in motion, but he couldn't have known how much it had escalated in his absence. The moment he stepped inside, the air felt thick, heavy with an unspoken tension. He found Claire sitting at the kitchen table, clutching a glass of wine with trembling hands. Her once confident demeanor had vanished, replaced by a haunted look in her eyes, a wild mix of despair and madness. Whatever had happened, it had broken her. As soon as Claire spotted him, her face twisted with rage. "You," she screamed, jumping to her feet. "You did this. You set me up, didn't you? You planned all of it." Alex took a step back, hands raised defensively. "Claire, calm down. What are you talking about? I didn't do anything." But she wasn't listening. She advanced toward him, her eyes blazing with anger and desperation. "You wanted to ruin me. To humiliate me in front of everyone." "Claire," Alex said softly, keeping his voice steady. "I'm your husband. I wouldn't do that to you. I didn't plan anything. Let's just sit down and talk, okay?" Her hands shook as she stood inches from him, her face pale with fury. And then, without warning, she spun toward the counter, grabbing a large kitchen knife. She turned back, brandishing the blade with a crazed look in her eyes. "I'll make you pay for this," she screamed, waving the knife wildly in his direction. "You think you can destroy me and just walk away?" Alex's heart raced, but he kept his composure, slowly backing away while pulling his phone from his pocket and dialing 911. "Claire, put the knife down," he said, his voice firm but calm. "You're not thinking clearly. You need help." She continued her rant, her grip on the knife tightening. "You ruined my life, Alex. You made me a laughingstock. You set me up, you're a monster." Within minutes, the police arrived, bursting through the door and quickly taking stock of the situation. Claire, still clutching the knife, was shouting incoherently as they gently but firmly disarmed her and led her out. Her face twisted in agony, and her words dissolved into a chaotic stream of jumbled, incoherent cries. As they took her away in handcuffs, Alex felt a strange mix of pity and relief. She was no longer in her right mind. This was the end. At the hospital, doctors confirmed that Claire had suffered a severe nervous breakdown. She was placed under temporary psychiatric care, and Alex saw this as his chance to finally close the chapter. While Claire was in treatment, he quietly withdrew a large sum from their joint account, moving it into a private account. With his lawyer's help, he drafted the divorce papers, preparing for the final stage of his plan. When Claire returned home, she found the house eerily empty and a stack of papers waiting on the kitchen counter. Alex had moved out without leaving any explanation other than the divorce documents and a note instructing her not to contact him. The realization hit hard, and fury welled up in her once again. A few days later, she contacted Alex, furious over the missing money. She accused him of stealing from her, but Alex was ready. Meeting her face to face, his expression was calm but unyielding. "I didn't steal anything, Claire," he said, his voice ice-cold. "But I'll tell you this, the house cameras have footage of you coming at me with a knife. If you want to keep playing games, I can press charges for attempted murder." Claire's face went pale as she realized the gravity of his words. Alex stepped closer, his tone laced with a chilling resolve. "You've lost your mind, Claire. You did all of this to yourself. I tried to live the way you wanted, pretending nothing had happened, but you tore it all apart with your lies and your insanity." Claire's anger quickly shifted to panic as she realized just how cornered she was. You can't do this," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Oh, I can," Alex replied, his voice unyielding. "And I already have. You're not getting a single dime from me. You've lost everything. And if you try to push me any further, I'll make sure everyone knows exactly what happened." With no options left, Claire reluctantly signed the divorce papers, knowing she was defeated. She lost her job, her reputation lay in ruins, and Dave was fired as well. The scandal had swept through their workplace, leaving nothing intact. Meanwhile, Alex walked away, free from the nightmare that had once been his marriage, his revenge complete. He had been patient, playing the part and letting Claire's own actions lead to her downfall. Now, with everything behind him, he moved on, finally free. Thank you for following along with the story. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to hit subscribe, leave a comment with your thoughts, and share with others. Have a fantastic day, and good luck.